The moment a 40-year marriage ends doesn't always come with a fight. Sometimes it arrives as a single text message on a quiet afternoon. My name is Margaret Whitmore, I'm 67 years old, and the message that ended my marriage appeared on my phone while I was sitting at the airport waiting for my husband. Daniel and I were supposed to be celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary that weekend. I remember the exact seat I was in at gate B14, watching planes taxi across the runway while holding 2 boarding passes in my hand. I had packed light, just a small carry-on, and the blue sweater Daniel once said made me look younger. After 40 years together, routines become quiet promises. You show up, you wait, you trust the other person will arrive. My phone buzzed just as the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. I expected Daniel to say he was stuck in traffic or running 10 minutes late. Instead, I read a message I will never forget. He wrote, "I'm taking Vanessa instead. Don't wait for me." At first I thought I had misunderstood the words. Vanessa was a name I had heard only once before, mentioned casually months earlier as someone from his office. I read the message again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change. It didn't. Around me, families were laughing, children were dragging backpacks across the floor, and a couple near the window was taking a selfie before their flight. Life in the airport continued like nothing had happened. But in that quiet moment, something inside me shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't call him back. I simply sat there, holding my phone, feeling the strange calm that comes when reality becomes very clear. 40 years together, and the end arrived in 12 words. I stood up, walked calmly to the airline counter, and canceled my ticket. The young agent asked if everything was all right. I smiled politely and told her my plans had changed. When I stepped outside into the cool Connecticut afternoon, the sky was gray and the parking lot smelled faintly like rain. I drove home slowly, thinking about every year Daniel and I had spent in that house. The garden we planted, the holidays we hosted, the furniture we bought piece by piece. But as I pulled into the driveway and looked at the familiar white siding of the house, another thought crossed my mind. Something Daniel had never cared about, something he had never paid attention to during all those years. Every document, every mortgage paper, every title. They were all in my name. And in that moment, standing in my own driveway with my phone still in my hand, I realized something Daniel probably hadn't thought about when he sent that message from his vacation. He believed he had just walked away from his wife. What he didn't realize was that he had also walked away from the house. That evening the house felt different, not emptier exactly, but quieter in a way that made every sound more noticeable. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen and the old clock above the stove ticked with the steady patience of something that had watched decades pass inside those walls. I set my purse on the counter and slowly walked through the living room, touching the back of the sofa, the wooden bookshelf Daniel built in the 1980s, and the small table where we used to place birthday cakes for our children. 40 years is a long time to share a space with someone, and every corner of that house carried a memory. Yet the message on my phone kept repeating in my mind like an echo that refused to fade. I am taking Vanessa instead. Do not wait for me. There was something strangely peaceful about knowing the truth so clearly. For months, maybe even years, I had felt a quiet distance growing between Daniel and me. He stayed later at the office, traveled more often, and sometimes answered simple questions with distracted half-sentences. I had told myself that age changes people, that life simply becomes busier. But now the puzzle pieces finally fit together. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table where I had paid bills for decades. The folder with our house documents was still inside the drawer beside me, exactly where I always kept it. Daniel never handled paperwork. He used to joke that numbers made his head spin, so I took care of the mortgage payments, insurance forms, property taxes, and every other document connected to the house. It had always seemed like a simple division of responsibility in a marriage. I opened the drawer and pulled the folder onto the table. The paper inside was organized neatly, each document dated and clipped together. Mortgage agreement, insurance records, property title. My eyes moved slowly across the printed lines, confirming what I already knew but had never truly thought about until that moment. The house was in my name. Not partially. Not jointly. Completely. Years earlier when we refinanced, the bank suggested placing the title under the person with the stronger credit history, which happened to be me at the time. Daniel signed the documents without reading much of the fine print. He trusted that I would handle it. I remember him laughing and saying that paperwork was my territory. Sitting there at the kitchen table now, I realized how important that small decision had become. Outside the window the sky was darkening and the streetlights along our quiet Connecticut neighborhood flickered on one by one. Somewhere down the block a dog barked and a car passed slowly along the road. Life was continuing exactly as it always had, but inside my mind something new was forming. I was not thinking about anger or revenge. I was thinking about options. Daniel believed he had stepped into a new chapter of his life while leaving the old one behind. What he did not realize was that the foundation of that old life was still sitting right here on this table in front of me, printed clearly on a stack of papers that said one simple thing in black ink. Owner, Margaret Whitmore. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen over the quiet street outside my bedroom window. For years Daniel had been the first one awake, shuffling into the kitchen to make coffee while the morning news played softly in the background. But that morning the house remained completely silent. I lay there for a few moments staring at the ceiling, listening to the stillness, reminding myself that the message from the airport had not been a dream. Daniel was somewhere on vacation with Vanessa, and I was alone in the home we had built together. Strangely, the feeling that settled over me was not sadness but clarity. After 40 years of marriage, clarity can feel almost unfamiliar. I got out of bed, made myself a simple breakfast, and poured a cup of coffee before sitting once again at the kitchen table. The folder with the house documents remained exactly where I had left it the night before. I opened it again, carefully reviewing the property title, the mortgage history, and the refinancing paperwork from years ago. Each page confirmed the same quiet truth. The house legally belonged to me. Daniel had signed every document without hesitation back then, trusting that I would handle the details just as I always had. At the time it felt like a practical arrangement, nothing more. But now the meaning of those papers had changed entirely. As I finished my coffee, another thought began forming in my mind, calm and deliberate. If the house was truly mine, then I needed to understand exactly what that meant. Not emotionally, but legally. I cleared the dishes from the table and walked into the small study near the living room where our desktop computer still sat on an old wooden desk. Daniel rarely used that room, but I had spent many evenings there organizing finances and paying bills. I turned on the computer and searched for a local attorney who specialized in property and family law. One name appeared again and again in the results, a man named Robert Hayes whose office was only 15 minutes away in downtown Hartford. His reviews described him as patient, direct, and thorough. That sounded exactly like the kind of person I needed to speak with. I called the office and a receptionist answered politely, asking how she could help me. My voice remained steady as I explained that I wanted to schedule a consultation regarding a property question. She offered me an appointment later that same afternoon. After I hung up the phone, I sat quietly for a moment, letting the decision settle in. 40 years of marriage had taught me that rushing into emotional reactions rarely leads anywhere useful. But careful decisions, made with a clear mind, can change everything. Outside the window, the morning sun was finally beginning to brighten the neighborhood. A few neighbors were leaving their driveways for work, waving casually as they passed. None of them knew that inside my house, a chapter of my life had already ended. And none of them could have guessed that later that afternoon, a simple conversation with a lawyer might quietly begin the next one. That afternoon I drove into Hartford with the folder of documents resting on the passenger seat beside me. The traffic was light. and the sky had cleared into a bright blue that almost felt out of place compared to the quiet storm that had settled inside my life. Robert Hayes had his office on the 4th floor of a modest brick building near the courthouse. It was not a flashy place, just a clean lobby with polished floors and a receptionist who greeted me with a polite smile when I stepped inside. A few minutes later I was sitting across from Mr. Hayes in a calm, well-organized office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. He appeared to be in his late 50s with gray hair and the kind of patient expression that suggested he had listened to many complicated stories over the years. I placed the folder on his desk and explained the situation carefully, keeping my voice steady as I described the message from my husband and the documents showing the house was titled in my name. Mr. Hayes listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding while reviewing the paperwork. After a few minutes he leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together. He told me something that made the entire situation even clearer than it had been the night before. According to the property title and the refinancing documents, the house legally belonged to me. That meant any decision involving the sale of the property would also belong to me. I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since the moment I opened the folder at my kitchen table. I asked him what would happen if I decided to sell the house while my husband was away. Mr. Hayes studied the documents once more and answered with the calm confidence of someone who knew the law very well. He said that as the sole legal owner I had the full right to sell the property if I chose to do so. There would be paperwork, of course, and standard closing procedures, but nothing in the documents required my husband's approval. I felt an unexpected sense of stillness settle over me as I absorbed his words. For decades I had thought of the house as something Daniel and I shared equally, the center of our family life and our future retirement. Yet the legal reality sitting on that desk told a different story. Mr. Hayes then asked me a simple question in return. He asked if I was seriously considering selling the home. I paused for a moment before answering because the truth was I had only begun thinking about the possibility that morning. But as I pictured Daniel returning from his vacation with Vanessa, walking confidently back into the life he assumed would still be waiting for him, the answer became clearer. I told Mr. Hayes that I was not certain yet, but I wanted to understand exactly how quickly a sale could happen if I decided to move forward. The attorney nodded thoughtfully and explained that in a strong housing market like the one we currently had in Connecticut, a well-priced home in a quiet neighborhood could attract buyers very quickly, especially if the seller was willing to consider a fast closing. As he spoke, a quiet plan was beginning to take shape in my mind, calm and deliberate, the kind of plan that does not come from anger but from clarity. When I left Robert Hayes's office that afternoon, the air outside felt cooler than it had earlier, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment watching people pass by on their way home from work. Everyone around me seemed busy with their normal routines, checking their phones, carrying briefcases, talking about dinner plans. It struck me how ordinary the world looked even when a life was quietly changing direction. I walked to my car and placed the folder of documents carefully on the passenger seat again, but this time my thoughts were much clearer than they had been that morning. During the drive back to my neighborhood, I replayed the conversation with Mr. Hayes in my mind. The facts were simple. The house belonged to me, legally and completely. If I wanted to sell it, the decision was mine alone. Daniel had made his choice when he sent that message from the airport, and he had done so without thinking about the life he was leaving behind. For 40 years I had been the person who kept everything organized and steady. I paid the bills, maintained the house, and made sure every document was filed properly. Now that quiet habit of responsibility had given me something unexpected. It had given me control. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the idea had already begun turning into a plan. The house stood there exactly as it always had, with the white porch railing Daniel painted years ago and the maple tree in the front yard that we planted when our daughter started kindergarten. I sat in the car for a moment looking at it, realizing how many chapters of my life had happened inside those walls. Letting go of a home filled with memories is not a small decision, especially after decades. But another thought came just as clearly. The memories belong to me, not the building. I stepped inside the house and walked slowly through each room again, seeing it differently now. Instead of imagining the past, I began noticing practical details. The hardwood floors were still in excellent condition. The kitchen cabinets had been updated 5 years earlier. The backyard deck had recently been repaired. It was the kind of property real estate agents described as well-maintained and move-in ready. I found my laptop in the study and opened a real estate website, searching for local agents who specialized in selling homes in our area. Several listings appeared, but one profile caught my attention. A woman named Linda Parker who had sold multiple homes in our neighborhood over the past few years. Her reviews mentioned quick sales and professional service. I picked up my phone and dialed the number listed on her website. When she answered, her voice sounded friendly and confident. I introduced myself and explained that I was considering selling my home and wanted to know how quickly she could arrange a viewing and discuss listing options. There was a brief pause before she replied that she would be happy to stop by the very next morning. As I ended the call and looked around the quiet living room, the plan that had begun as a simple legal question was now moving forward. Daniel believed he was enjoying a carefree vacation somewhere far away. What he did not know was that back home, the life he expected to return to was already beginning to change. The next morning I woke up with a clear plan already forming in my mind. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window as I made a cup of coffee and straightened a few things around the house. If someone was going to look at this place with the possibility of buying it, I wanted it to look exactly the way it had always been when guests came over for holidays. Clean, calm, welcoming. At 9:30 sharp a silver sedan pulled into the driveway and a woman stepped out carrying a leather folder and a tablet. Linda Parker turned out to be exactly the kind of real estate agent her reviews described. She had a confident handshake, a friendly smile, and the quick attentive eyes of someone who had spent years studying houses the way a doctor studies patients. I invited her inside and she began walking slowly from room to room, occasionally making notes on her tablet while asking simple questions about the property. How old was the roof? When had the kitchen been renovated? Had there been any recent upgrades to the heating system? I answered each question calmly, explaining the improvements we had made over the years. As she walked through the living room and into the backyard, she nodded with quiet approval. She told me the house was in excellent condition and that homes in this neighborhood had been selling quickly during the past few months. When we returned to the kitchen table, she opened her folder and began explaining what she believed the property could realistically sell for. The number she suggested was higher than I expected, well over $1 million, especially if the listing attracted multiple buyers. I listened carefully while she described how quickly a sale might happen if we priced the home competitively and allowed serious buyers to move quickly with cash offers or fast financing. Then she asked the question every real estate agent eventually asks. She looked at me kindly and said that before moving forward she needed to know if I was emotionally ready to sell a home where I had lived for so many years. It was a fair question. I looked around the kitchen for a moment, remembering the birthday parties, the family dinners, the quiet evenings when Daniel and I used to sit here talking about our future plans. But that future had already changed the moment he decided to walk away. I turned back to Linda and told her something simple and honest. I said that sometimes a house holds beautiful memories, but sometimes it also holds chapters that have already ended. She studied my expression for a moment and then nodded with quiet understanding. After that the conversation became practical. She explained that if I signed the listing agreement that day she could arrange professional photos within 24 hours and place the house on the market immediately. Serious buyers could begin scheduling viewings by the end of the week. As she slid the paperwork across the table toward me, I noticed how steady my hands felt as I picked up the pen. It was not anger guiding my decision. It was clarity. Daniel was still somewhere far away enjoying the vacation he had chosen, probably assuming everything at home would remain exactly the way he left it. But as I signed my name on the listing agreement, the quiet truth was that the life waiting for him here was already beginning to disappear. Within 2 days, the house was officially on the market and the quiet rhythm of my life changed into something strangely active. Linda Parker moved quickly, just as she promised. Professional photographs were taken the next morning, showing the sunlight through the living room windows, the polished hardwood floors, and the garden that had been carefully maintained for decades. When the listing appeared online later that afternoon, she sent me the link and explained that interested buyers were already asking to schedule showings. I remember sitting at the kitchen table again with my laptop open, looking at the photographs of the same rooms I had walked through thousands of times. It felt almost surreal to see my own home presented as a property ready for someone else's future. Over the next 48 hours, several people came to see the house. Linda handled everything with calm efficiency, arranging appointments and guiding visitors through the rooms while I stepped out for walks around the neighborhood. Each time I returned home, the house felt slightly less like a place I was protecting and more like something I was preparing to release. Late on the third evening, Linda called with a tone of excitement in her voice. She told me that 2 different buyers had submitted offers, both strong and serious. One of them was particularly interested in closing quickly because they had recently relocated for work and wanted to settle before the end of the month. The number she mentioned was exactly within the range she had predicted earlier, and the buyer was willing to move forward with a very fast closing if the paperwork could be arranged. I listened quietly while she explained the details, and then I asked the one question that mattered most to me. I asked how quickly everything could realistically be completed if I accepted the offer. Linda paused for a moment before answering. She said that with a motivated buyer and the right legal preparation, the closing process could move faster than most people expected. It would still require inspections and official documents, but in the current market it might be possible to finish everything in less than 2 weeks. I thanked her and told her I would review the offer carefully that evening. After ending the call, I walked slowly through the house again, pausing in the doorway of the living room where Daniel and I had once hosted Thanksgiving dinners for our entire family. The furniture looked exactly the same as it had for years, but my perspective had changed completely. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Daniel was still enjoying the vacation he had chosen, probably believing that he would eventually return to this house and continue his life here as if nothing had truly changed. But the quiet truth was that decisions were already moving forward without him. I sat down at the kitchen table once more and read through the offer Linda had sent me. The buyer was serious, the price was fair, and the timeline was fast. As I placed the document back on the table, I realized that everything was now happening exactly the way a clear plan tends to unfold when each step is taken calmly. Daniel had chosen to step away from the life we built together. And while he was gone, that life was quietly finding a new owner. The next few days moved forward with a quiet momentum that almost surprised me. After I accepted the offer, everything began unfolding exactly as Linda Parker had predicted. The buyer scheduled a home inspection within 2 days, and a polite young couple arrived with a clipboard and a small set of tools. They walked carefully through each room, checking outlets, testing faucets, and examining the heating system in the basement. I answered their questions calmly, explaining the improvements we had made over the years and showing them the records I had kept organized in a binder. When they finished, they thanked me for maintaining the home so well. Hearing that felt strangely comforting, as if the decades of care I had invested in that house were being quietly acknowledged by someone who could see its value. Later that evening, Linda called again to say the inspection had gone smoothly and the buyers were ready to proceed without requesting any changes. That meant the next step would be the closing process. Paperwork moved quickly after that. Documents arrived through email and courier, each one requiring signatures that felt less emotional than I expected. Instead of sadness, I felt a calm sense of completion. 40 years of shared life had filled those rooms with memories, but the house itself had simply been a place that held them. The memories would remain with me no matter where I lived next. A few days later, I met Robert Hayes again at his office to review the final documents. He explained each page carefully, making sure everything was clear before I signed. When the last form was completed, he looked up and told me the closing date was officially scheduled for the following week. If everything stayed on track, ownership of the property would transfer to the buyer that very afternoon. I drove home slowly after that meeting, noticing the familiar streets of my neighborhood with a slightly different perspective. The maple tree in the front yard was beginning to show the first signs of autumn color, and the porch where Daniel and I once drank coffee on Sunday mornings looked peaceful in the late afternoon sunlight. Yet I knew the scene was about to belong to someone else. Over the next few days, I began quietly packing the things that truly mattered to me. Family photographs, personal letters, the small jewelry box my mother had given me years ago, and a few keepsakes from our children's childhood. Everything else felt less important than it once had. Furniture and decorations could be replaced, but the meaningful parts of a life were much smaller and easier to carry. During that time, my phone remained almost completely silent. Daniel never called. Perhaps he was still enjoying the trip he had chosen, confident that nothing at home would change while he was away. But as the closing date approached, the quiet truth was that the house he believed he would return to was already preparing for a new owner. And by the time his vacation ended, the place he once called home would no longer belong to him at all. The morning of the closing arrived quietly, almost like any other day, except the house felt lighter than it had in years. Most of my belongings were already packed into a few neatly labeled boxes stacked in the back of my car and inside the small apartment I had rented across town. I walked through the empty rooms one last time before leaving for the attorney's office, noticing how sound echoed slightly now that the furniture had been moved. The living room where our family once gathered looked larger without the sofa and bookshelves. The kitchen table where I had spent countless mornings organizing bills and schedules was gone, leaving only the sunlight pouring across the hardwood floor. I paused in the doorway for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. 40 years of life had happened inside those walls, and for a long time I believed that house would always be part of my future. But life has a way of changing direction when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. I closed the front door gently behind me and drove into Hartford for the final appointment. Robert Hayes was already waiting when I arrived, along with the buyers and their agent. The process itself was calm and professional, a series of documents passed across the table, each one confirming that ownership of the house was being transferred. I read each page carefully before signing my name, the same steady signature I had written on so many documents throughout my marriage. Within less than an hour, everything was complete. Robert Hayes looked up from the final document and told us that the transaction had officially been recorded. The house now belonged to the buyers. A wire transfer confirmation appeared on my phone shortly afterward, showing the full payment deposited into my account. It was a strange moment, not filled with triumph or sadness, but with a quiet sense of closure. When I walked out of the building that afternoon, the sky was bright and clear, and the air carried the first hint of autumn. I drove past my old neighborhood once more before heading to my new apartment, not out of regret but simply to see it one last time. The house looked exactly the same from the street, peaceful and ordinary, as if nothing important had happened there at all. Later that evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, my phone finally rang. The name on the screen was Daniel. For a moment I imagined the scene on the other end of the call. He had probably just returned from his trip, suitcase in hand, expecting to unlock the front door and step back into the life he thought would still be waiting for him. I answered calmly and listened as confusion filled his voice while he asked why strangers were inside the house and why his key no longer worked. I let him finish speaking before replying in the same quiet tone I had used all week. I told him the truth as simply as possible. The house had been sold. There was a long silence on the line after that. Finally he asked how that could have happened without him knowing. I looked out the window of my new apartment at the evening lights of the city and gave him the only answer that mattered. I told him that sometimes when a person walks away from their life, they should not be surprised when that life moves on without them.